Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, it might surprise some people here that while what we are dealing with here is important, we're not the center of the universe. All across this country, as I was reminded of this morning, calling home and speaking to friends and family and my wife, my children, life goes on. Most Americans, I think, are aware that there's an issue going on here in Washington, D.C. with regards to funding the government. But I doubt very few of them are sitting in front of the CNN countdown clock, or I guess now we're on the ticker because we're into the shutdown, living it as some sort of reality drama. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it's the reality that life goes on. And so because people aren't following this every single day and aren't checking their phones on a 15-minute basis to find out how this thing is going to be fixed, I think a lot of people are a little bit confused about what's happening here. And if you're just listening to it kind of off the top, in between things, or maybe on the radio, maybe some people have the perception that this is all about a disagreement regarding the budget and or disagreement solely about an issue that is of critical importance and we need to deal with right away. And that's just not accurate, and I'll get to that in a moment. But it's still hard for people to understand then how this happens. When I explain to people kind of where we are and how we got here, it just doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But I want to begin by something, the Bible says that there's nothing new under the sun. It's one of the things that came into my mind early this morning. I had occasion a few weeks ago around the New Year to spend some time with my family at the wonderful national park facilities, which I hope are open today in Philadelphia. And in the halls were our Constitution, the very document that has designed our system of government, that each of us appeals to, that each of us has sworn allegiance to, was debated. That debate was a contentious one. It began on the 23rd of May and ended on the 17th of September of the year 1787. It was actually contentious from the start. In fact, the New York delegation only stayed a few days, and the delegation from Rhode Island straight out boycotted it. What's ironic, by the way, is that one of the most contentious issues in that Constitutional Convention was the creation of this very Senate. The creation of this body was a heated discussion. We don't know a lot about the details of that discussion because they had closed the windows even though it was hot. They didn't go around talking about it. There wasn't 24-hour news cycles and Twitter. But we know it was contentious, and we know that in the end, this Constitution that we all swear allegiance to and that for over 2 centuries has helped create here an exceptional system of government, was approved by 39 of the 55 delegates. So there were people that voted against the Constitution. And the one thing that was clear is that none of them got everything they wanted. Now, at that time, by the end of that convention, in fact, on the 17th, Monday, September 17th, 1787, was the last day of that convention, and one of the delegates was someone named Benjamin Franklin. We all know who that is. He was internationally well known, and he wanted to give a short speech to that convention before signing it. He was actually too weak to do the speech himself, and so he had someone else deliver the speech. And based on the notes that Madison took, here's what we know generally he said. It begins with a line. It says, "I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve." It goes on to say, "I agree to this Constitution with all of its faults." He says, "I doubt, too, whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected." So right from the very beginning, in the history of this nation, we have acknowledged that in order to make progress, it is virtually impossible for everybody in that process to get everything they want. Our job is to move things forward, and I don't want to read the whole thing, but suffice it to say Franklin's point is maybe he was wrong. He's not perfect, even though many of us tend to believe that we're the only people that are right on this issue. At that stage in his life, he had learned enough to understand that he was not the holder of all wisdom, that he had changed his mind on issues when he came upon new information. And he also understood that when you bring a group of people together and ask them to come to agreement on something, unless they are clones of one another, or unless they all come from the same thought process, you're going to have disagreements. But in order to reach a conclusion, everyone's going to have to get something they need, even though no one's going to get everything that they want. And that was from the very beginning, from our very founding. And it was hard then. Imagine now, in the 21st century, with 50 states and several territories, extraordinary diversity in terms of ideology, opinion, geography, background, and all of it covered by 24-hour news, which basically covers American politics like entertainment, and Twitter feeds that are on both sides that are constantly driving narratives. Imagine if they had Twitter and 24-hour news during the Constitutional Convention. A, we would know a lot more about what they were saying to and about each other. And B, we may never have had a constitution simply because exacerbating those tensions. Now, I'm not here to say that we should not have Twitter and not have 24-hour news. I'm just telling you these are factors. It was always difficult. Self-government was always hard. Imagine today with these additional factors of diversity and the way politics is covered, practiced, and discussed. I say that because there's a growing temptation in American politics that largely comes from the base of both parties, but often is fed through media narrative, that the goal is to achieve total victory. Total victory is what you want to achieve in a sporting event. You want to win and you want to beat your opponent by as many points as possible. But in a constitutional republic, total victory is nearly impossible, especially in a country like America. It's impossible. It's impossible for a president, for any party, or for a faction on any issue to get 100% of what they want all the time. Instinctively, despite the fact they don't work here every day, despite the fact that they don't sit glued in front of the television all day watching politics, most Americans understand that. They just do. They know it because that's the reality of life, and they know it instinctively because that's the way our system was designed. That's the way self-government was supposed to function. It's hard. Self-government has never been easy. It's only gotten harder. And so when you talk to someone and you explain what's happened, here's the facts. We had a government funding deadline, meaning if by midnight this morning we had not passed a bill to authorize more spending, we have this sort of mini shutdown or partial shutdown of the government. There is a provision that was put in law by President Obama that gave status to young people who were brought in this country illegally by their parents through no fault of their own. And that provision expires on the 5th of March, about 43 days away. We have a bill before the Senate that funds the government, that keeps it open for 4 weeks initially. I think now we're down, the proposal before the Senate, I think, is to end on the 9th, so about 3 weeks. And there's nothing in that bill that the Democrats are against. But they voted against that bill last night, and they are not letting us vote on the other bill today, right now, and intend to vote against it, apparently, when we do vote on it Monday morning, because they want to see their demands met on something that doesn't expire for 43 days. So this is not about whether you're for or against doing something about DACA. It's not. Because it's not like the government funding expired last night and DACA expired last night, and so you have to do both. This is the government funding expired last night, DACA expires in 43 days. And when you explain that to people, they're like, well, how does that work? Why does that make sense? Why would they do this? So in fairness, I listened to the argument of my Democratic colleagues, and one of the arguments they make is that they don't trust the Republican Party on the issue of DACA, but more particularly, they don't trust the president to deal with it. And so they need to force action now. They need to do something, and they need to use government funding as the leverage to force it to happen. Now, let me say at the outset that it is a legitimate tool in the toolbox of a legislator on a matter of deep principle to not vote on an important bill in order to get leverage for what you want. So if there's something that you're deeply principled about and you believe we need to do, it is a legitimate tool to say, I know you really need to do this, and I really need to do that, and so I'm not going to let you do what you need to do unless you let me do what I need to do. And I think that's the argument they're making now. As I pointed out to you earlier, it's not kind of the same, because this is a spending deal that will only take, the fact that the bill they voted against would expire even before the March 5th deadline of DACA. So in essence, we would have to have another government funding vote even before we got to March 5th. So it's really not a leverage argument. But even if it was, I would say that in order for the self-government to work, as I've described already, we have to be judicious and careful about how we use these tools. You can't be using them all the time. You've got to reserve them for key moments for a lot of reasons. The first, frankly, is international implications. You know, we talk a lot here about Russian interference, which occurred, and basically the goal of Russian interference above all else was to sow discord and to create conflict and controversy around American politics so Vladimir Putin can go around the world saying, America likes to lecture everyone about their democracy, but their democracy is not a real democracy, and their leaders are corrupt, and their elections are rigged, and all kinds of stuff. That's what he wanted to drive. And there are nations like China that under our very nose are rapidly working to change the world in our time. You know, while we spend all these days arguing with each other about whatever the outrage of the day is, you know, every day it's something else, China is like working underneath us and all around us to rebuild the world in their image and to their advantage and at our detriment. And one of the things they tell other countries is the Americans is a country in decline. These people are in total decline, they're abandoning the world, and more importantly, they can't even govern themselves. And so we're doing their job for them when we create these sorts of controversies. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have heated debates on tough issues, and that shouldn't mean that in time to time people reserve the right, and I reserve the right, to use leverage as a tool to achieve our goals. I've done it before, I imagine I'll do it again. But we have to be careful about it because it does impact the way the world views us. People watch this stuff all over the world, and they don't understand, as some of us do, that this stuff happens and it all works out. They think, they literally, some places believe that we are crumbling, ripped apart at the seams. And it encourages people to do things, and nations to do things, sometimes through miscalculation. So that's the first reason why you want to be careful. The second reason why you want to be judicious about using these sorts of tools is because, quite frankly, it poisons the process. I would say that the abuse and the overuse of these prerogatives as senators over the last decade has done tremendous damage to the Senate, and it really has impacted our ability to tackle and to solve real problems. And I say that to you as someone that acknowledges that Republicans have done this. Republicans did this kind of stuff. I would argue that it was different, but it doesn't matter. Republicans used leverage in situations that people thought we shouldn't have used it. And Democrat activists now insist that Democrats use the same tool. They did it when they were in the minority. You need to do it now when you're in the minority. And I would also say that we have to be careful because the truth is we all have matters of deep principle. I have matters of deep principle that haven't been addressed yet. I have a matter of deep principle, and as much as I believe we need to do something about DACA, I have a matter of deep principle that I believe is more urgent and requires attention right away. The people of Florida, the people of Puerto Rico, the people of Texas, they have a desperate need for disaster relief. Yeah, 40% of the island of Puerto Rico has no electricity. This is a U.S. territory, American citizens living in third world conditions. In the state of Florida, our citrus growers are in critical condition. We may not have a U.S. citrus industry based in Florida if this goes on much longer. You still have people living in hotel rooms and motel rooms in Florida because their homes were destroyed. That is a real need that doesn't have any deadline, like they needed it yesterday. And we still haven't addressed it. And so I suppose if I wanted to use this tool, and some maybe encourage me to do that, I could come here and say, I'm not voting for any funding in the government, and I'll shut down the government until we deal with disaster relief. The problem is all 99 other senators have a principled position as well. And so basically all we do is take hostages all day on every principled issue we have, every opportunity we get. Well, you get the picture. And it's starting to happen more and more. And by the way, I say all this to you understanding that if we passed a long-term funding bill, let's say that the bill before us funded government through October, and I voted for that, and disaster relief hadn't happened yet, there's no guarantee that we would get disaster relief. What leverage would I have? So we have to be very judicious about how we use it. Ultimately, I decided not to do it because I actually think a government shutdown ends up hurting the people that I'm trying to help through disaster relief. There are federal employees in Puerto Rico that got hit by a hurricane a few months ago and now can't go to work on Monday. And if they go to work, they're not getting paid, and it's already difficult over there. There are federal services in Florida. You know, people are going to call our offices around the country and in Florida on Monday, and even if I have essential staff there to answer the call, there may not be an employee at the federal agency that we can pick up the phone and intervene on their behalf. And it happens all the time. You know, one of the very common things that we face, calls that we get, is someone has a loved one or a relative that was visiting somewhere around the world, maybe in the Western Hemisphere. They were killed in an accident. They want to bring their body home to be buried, and we've got to deal with all the paperwork of the embassy or the consulate in the host country and bringing them in. We're not going to be there on Monday to do it because the people we got to call may not even be there to answer the call. So in the end, my view of it is you don't cut off your nose to spite your face, and at this point, you don't shut down the government to help people only to take or hurt them somewhere else. So at the end of the day, this really is not about leverage. It's not. Because I say this with the highest of respect. We disagree on a lot of issues, but the Democratic leader is someone that I know understands legislation and understands politics. I personally do not believe that this is about leverage. He has to know this because this is really no different than in December. We passed a short-term spending deal in December, and Democratic members voted for that at the time, and the DACA issue was unresolved at the time. By the way, we had a chance to deal with disaster relief in December, too. They sent the disaster relief bill over from the House to the Senate, and the Democratic leader chose not to take it up, I believe, because he wanted to hold it over for all this debate. The more things were pending, the more leverage you have, supposedly. But irrespective, the point is that, and I mean take up this, we were going to put additional things on that House bill and send it back. We knew what those things were, but suffice it to say it remains unresolved. But I don't think this is purely about leverage. Here's what I actually think this is about in many ways. And I'm here to cite some examples of why I think it's easy to prove. So in December, as I just said before we got ready to leave for the end of the year, there were a lot of activists involved in the DACA issue that were really pounding on the Democrats to shut down the government unless DACA was handled. And to their credit, a number of Democratic senators didn't do so. They voted not to shut down the government. And the end result was they unleashed a furious assault in terms of pressure and protests and sleep-ins and all kinds of things. But this really started back in October. I have a number of articles here that I want to cite to prove it. Let's go to October 2nd of 2017. And this is an article that talks about, here I'll just quote from it. I underlined the key provisions. The Democrats seeking an immigration deal are facing resistance from immigrant activists who are rejecting any compromise that would tighten border security and demanding more extensive legislation to protect illegal immigrants from deportation. It goes on to say, despite Democratic leaders' declared commitment to help so-called dreamers, they are catching sustained flack from immigration activists. It goes on to say, this now talks about the minority leader in the House, Congresswoman Pelosi. It says she faced a vociferous protest from Dreamers a few weeks ago when activists shouted down her speech and called her a liar who helped create a deportation machine. If you haven't seen the video, she did a press conference in, I believe, San Francisco. And as she was there doing this press conference with Dreamers, these other Dream activist people showed up and started screaming at her. So for those of us on my side of the aisle, we kind of view her as one of the more liberal members in Congress, and certainly someone that I've identified as a supporter of the DREAM Act. And there you have people saying, well, the DREAM Act's not enough. You got to cover other people. So they're under a lot of pressure. Here's a quote from an immigrant rights advocate and a DACA recipient. He said, quote, I think Senator Schumer crumbles under pressure just so he can deliver on something. This is harsh words from these activists, and this is starting in October of last year. Now let's go to December 19th, this article on December 19th. This article begins by saying dozens of immigration advocates rallied outside Senator Chuck Schumer's Manhattan office on Tuesday. In both Spanish and in English, speakers at the rally demanded that the Senate Minority Leader ask his fellow Democrats to refrain from supporting any legislation until a Clean Dream Act is passed. Clean Dream Act means just vote for the Dream Act, nothing else, no border security. And by the way, any legislation, like don't vote for anything until that happens. This is the pressure they were under. The article goes on to say, as Congress negotiates the budget, protesters called for Schumer to help shut down the government if a Dream Act isn't passed by the end of the year, chanting, "If we don't get it, shut it down." Those are the quotes of the piece. This is in December. So this article was December 19th. This must have been December 18th. And the chant outside his office in Manhattan was, "If we don't get it, shut it down." So calls for shutdown began as far back as December. Not 43 days before the deadline, but 60 or 70 days before the deadline. So finally, the spokeswoman for the minority leader put out a statement to, I believe, the protesters, but I guess the press was assembled, and she said, "We want to make sure nothing passes until we have the DREAM Act in there." So they're already telegraphing this from December. So this is not something that's happened in the last 2 days or 3 days. This is ongoing and sustained pressure. We have more. On December 21st is an article in the Washington Post, the headline, "In Private Meetings, Schumer Angrily Confronted by Hispanic Caucus Members as Prospects for DACA Deal Slip Again." It begins, I'll read it. It says, "Disagreements among Democrats over how to keep fighting to enact legal protection for immigrant dreamers boiled over in the office of Senate Minority Leader Charles H. Schumer on Thursday, as he met with members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus in what several participants described as a tense and heated exchange. With just a few minutes' notice, they showed up in the lobby of Schumer's suite across from the Senate floor in hopes of pressing him to persuade more senators to vote against the GOP spending plan that was set to be approved in the coming hours. The latest short-term spending plan was set for approval as Democrats this week backed off a pledge to force a vote this month over the fate of thousands of undocumented immigrants brought to this country as children. Their decision angered immigration activists. Later in the article, several people who attended the meeting, granted anonymity to describe what was expected to be a private exchange, said the meeting with Schumer began with cordial remarks, but then Representative Luis Gutierrez unloaded on Schumer, accusing him and Democratic senators of not caring about the fate of dreamers and of throwing them under the bus. In response, Schumer raised his voice, telling Gutierrez not to insult fellow Democrats. Gutierrez shot back, telling Schumer, "Don't raise your voice." But a few other caucus members also made pointed comments towards Schumer. Later in the day, Gutierrez tweeted, after all, that the fight continues in January. I think we're all on the same page. Pressure, incredible pressure being mounted the whole time. Probably one more thing I'll cite here. This is from The New Yorker, January 18th, so we're now going to January. "Many Democratic activists are demanding that Schumer and other elected Democrats vote against the GOP spending bill, even at the risk of a government shutdown. On Wednesday, 3 protesters from the Dream Action Coalition were arrested while demonstrating outside Schumer's office in New York City. Some Democratic activists and strategists are arguing that the party should take its stand now while the stench of Trump's, alleged comments is still hanging in the air." So this is all about political pressure. That's the leverage point. That's why this is happening, not about leverage. And it's untenable. The position they've established is untenable. Most people in America just wouldn't agree with this. If you're being honest with yourself, I challenge anyone. Go into any diner in your state or call 10 people that are just kind of, follow politics a little bit but not activists or whatever, and just ask them. Ask them, do you think it is right to shut down the government over an issue that we have until March 5th to fix? Ask them that. Call people and ask them, do you think it is a smart thing to do to close the federal government over an issue that we have another 43 days to address? You know what the answer is going to be. You do. That's why the position they've adopted is untenable, but that tells you the amount of political pressure they're under to do this. This is all motivated by that. This is all motivated by incredible amount of pressure brought to bear on my Democratic colleagues, in particular on the Democratic leader, by activists. And brings us to this point. By the way, I would also argue that this strategy, in addition to being driven by that, is counterproductive. So yesterday there was supposed to be a meeting with the White House and congressional leaders from both parties to keep working on this issue of DACA. The Democrats didn't show up, probably because they're too busy dealing with a shutdown. So this isn't making arriving at a deal for DACA easier, it's making it harder. Now, on this argument that they don't trust, like if we don't do this, we can't trust the president's going to do this, I don't think that's true. I think there's a balance of leverage here that exists that almost guarantees that something can happen if we want something to happen. So let's begin with this fact. The President of the United States, he campaigned on a very specific promise. We know what that promise was. He was going to build a wall and secure the border, okay? The president knows. He needs 60 votes in the Senate. The president knows, he knows that he isn't going to get that promise fulfilled. The president's not going to get a border wall. We're not going to get increased security unless we do something about DACA. They're well aware of that at the White House. I think they have said that openly. What is important to remember as well is that there isn't going to be a deal on DACA unless you have a deal on the wall. That's the way our system works. And I say that to you as someone that supports a wall and supports dealing with DACA. But as I've already talked about earlier, in this system of government, it is not a zero-sum game. It cannot be, I get the wall and you get nothing, and it cannot be, we get DACA and even more, and you don't get the wall. It's not going to work. And right now, we have a lot of wasting of time going on, entertaining ridiculous fantasies about what could be achieved here. A bill that creates permanent status under DACA but would allow some future Congress to stop funding the wall isn't going to pass. The president's not going to sign that. Think about it. You have a wall that takes 10 years to build, and you have DACA that's permanent. Next year they don't fund it. DACA stays, the wall's not there. They're not going to sign that. A bill that creates a path to citizenship under DACA, but then also allows the recipients of that citizenship to use it to bring in their parents who brought them into the country illegally. The president's not going to sign that. That's just reality. And I say this to you as someone that has tremendous sympathy for the young people who were brought here as minors, yes, in violation of the law, but through no fault of their own. They didn't commit a crime, and now they find themselves with no legal immigration status. It would be a mistake, in my opinion, to allow their status to expire without a replacement. There are practical reasons why it would be a mistake. We've spent years in taxpayer money educating them. We would be hurting their employers. These people are working somewhere now. Overnight, they can't work there anymore. They might even own a business. You'd be hurting the people that work for them. Maybe they're married to a U.S. citizen. You'd be hurting a U.S. citizen who's their spouse. Maybe they have children who are U.S. citizens, and these children need those parents. You would be hurting them. These are the practical reasons why we shouldn't let it expire. There are moral reasons why we shouldn't let it expire, too. It's immoral to have laws that punish anyone for the mistakes their parents made. It's immoral to deport someone to a country they've never really lived in. You were 2 years old when you came from Honduras. You don't even speak Spanish. You don't even know anybody there, and they're going to send you there. It didn't feel right. It's my deepest belief that if DACA expires and we allow 700 young adults to have to spend the majority of their lives, who have spent the majority of their lives among us, are forced to leave this country, I think it would be a dark stain on our history. I think future generations will look back at that and say, that was a terrible thing those people did back then. And I think we have more support for what I just said in the Republican Party than we have ever had in the 7 years that I have been here. But I have to be fair, and I want to be frank. It is also a mistake to overreach on the other side of this argument. It is fair to argue that we should deal with DACA because it's the moral and compassionate thing to do. It is fair to argue that dealing with DACA is in our national interest, but it is a big mistake to demand a right that does not exist. There is no right to illegally immigrate to any country on the planet. No one has a right to DACA, but dealing with DACA is the right thing to do. And I think it's also overreaching to insist that not only must DACA recipients be accommodated, but we also have to accommodate their parents. And maybe because I personally know so many people under these circumstances, I am personally open to figuring out something that allows their parents to stay, especially if the children are minors. But I understand it's not a majority position in my party, and I have to be honest with you. I believe that if we take the position around here that we are not accepting any deal unless it takes care of both the DACA recipient and the parent, if that's the hard position we adopt and people are unwilling to move off of it, I think there may be no deal at all. And that means that neither the recipients of DACA nor the parents will have anything. By the way, I also think it's overreach to oppose a border wall because you find it symbolically offensive. First, America has a right, and more importantly, a responsibility to protect its borders and enforce its laws. And second, there's not going to be a DACA deal of any kind without a wall, period. Donald Trump is not going to sign, cannot sign, and will not sign a bill that doesn't have real enforcement. That's a fact. That has to happen. So what is the way forward? Right now, the government is shut down. You won't really notice till Monday, but on Monday, people will start to notice. DACA expires 6 weeks from Monday. So on Monday, if we haven't done anything, the government will be shut down, and we have 43 days to go until DACA. I think we need to fund the government on a short-term basis. Maybe it's February 9th, and then we spend the next 3 weeks working on an agreement on defense, an agreement on disaster relief, and an agreement on border security and DACA. And for Democrats that are worried that they don't have leverage, you have plenty of leverage without shutting down the government. For example, there are 2 Republicans who oppose short-term spending in general. Then you have several Republican members who oppose any longer-term spending without defense spending increases. In essence, this worry that you have that they're going to just fund the government for 6 months and walk away from DACA, there's at least 5 Republicans that are going to vote no on that. 3 because of defense, and several because of defense, and 2 because of short-term spending. And then you add to that, there are at least 3 other Republican members, myself being one of them, who will have a lot of trouble voting for a long-term spending plan that doesn't include disaster relief. That alone gives you leverage to ensure that not only do those issues need to be dealt with, but all 3 of them would have to be dealt with in order for there to be any long-term deal that forecloses the leverage that you want. You have another piece of leverage. The president needs to fulfill his campaign promise, which Americans supported at the ballot box, build the wall. And he knows he can't do that without a DACA deal. So really both sides here have leverage. But as long as the government's shut down, we're wasting valuable time. Monday could have been a day that people met and hashed out key details of the DACA thing. Instead, Monday will probably be all about the shutdown. And maybe Tuesday, and maybe Wednesday. We are wasting time we do not have. Finally, as for DACA, what is the way forward on that? You know, there's a lot of bills or ideas going around, not actually bills, but ideas. Here's what I would say to you. The baseline and the core of any agreement is one that basically codifies DACA, in essence deals with the president's decision to suspend the executive order on it, and funds in a way that can guarantee continued funding the president's immigration enforcement plan. That's the core. You codify DACA, and you do something to ensure that the wall is going to be built and that they can't come back and cancel the funding. And then the Senate can go into an open amendment process and debate any additional matters you want to put in there. For example, maybe there's a deal that instead of codifying DACA alone, actually creates a pathway to citizenship under DACA. But it eliminates all future applicants, not just DACA applicants, future applicants from being able to sponsor parents. I'm not saying that it would pass, but that might be a debate that happens. And even if you can't reach 60 votes on any of these amendments people are offering, even if all those amendments fail, in the end you are at least left with a bill that secures our border and gives certainty, permanent certainty, to close to 700,000 people who currently are registered under DACA. That means that, like Benjamin Franklin said after he agreed to the Constitution in 1787, we may all be left with a law in which none of us got everything we wanted, but everyone got something that they needed. The DACA recipients would have the certainty of knowing that they can stay in America legally for the rest of their lives. And perhaps future Congresses and future presidents may build upon that. And the president would have achieved a signature campaign promise and achieved something Republicans and many Democrats have been promising to do but failed to deliver for over 15 years. And that's to secure the border and build a wall. There is a way forward on all of these things. If we remember how our system works, we can start making it happen. But I think it will require us to accept what it takes to make progress in a constitutional republic. And we can't even begin to do it until we end the shutdown. And that's what I hope we'll do sooner rather than later. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.